Welcome back. In this episode, we're going to have a look at the demo scene I've prepared for you, and we're going to go through aspects in the scene, and you can see how it's built and how these pictures that I've shown you in the beginning were created. For that, you're going to go and load the demo scene that's called First Hour. It's probably going to be in a different location for you than it is for me, but there'll be instructions provided where to find this icon here. That's probably going to look a little bit better in your version as well. I just haven't had a chance to prepare that yet. So if you double click this, the one that says First Hour Demo, if you double click that, then Daz Studio is going to ask you, would you like to save your previous scene? We don't really need to do that. We can say no, and then it'll take a moment to load it. And this is going to bring in all the objects that are hopefully installed already, which is the Victoria, as well as the Rocky Mountain backyard, as well as all the other products that come with this bundle. It takes a moment to appear, so be patient. There we go. We can see our first character, and we know now she's framed up through a camera that I've set up here. These are the 7 cameras that I've included with this. So just like I've shown you in the beginning, you can switch to the first one, which is the establishing shot. And this is what it looks like. Or you can just switch the aspect frame on as well to see exactly what's being framed up if you wanted to make any changes to that. The second one was this from behind one of the characters. This light here, I think I've switched off for rendering because that's a little bit bright here. We'll see how to do that in a moment. Then we have number 3 here. This is behind this character. Then we have camera number 4. That's kind of a mid shot. 5 is a mid shot of the other character. And this is all in filament right now. So if you want to switch this over to iRay, it'll take a little bit longer to load, but you'll then see the accurate preview that you've seen in the beginning. Then there's camera number 6, that's a close-up of her. And then this is camera number 7, which is a close-up of the other character. Now notice that in filament, certain features are missing, like the depth of field. If I were to switch this on, or let's go back to her. If I were to switch filament on here, then you will see that after a moment or so, but it'll be very difficult to make adjustments that will then appear like 5 seconds later. So it's not ideal to make adjustments. It's great for checking and it's great for final output, but we do recommend that you work in one of the faster preview modes that might not be as accurate, but it'll give you the immediate results of what your changes look like. So if you change a parameter dial, then the changes of that are immediately reflected in the real-time viewports. Let's play around with the first parameter since we've been talking about cameras a moment ago, namely the depth of field. I've set up the focal plane so that it is where it needs to be so that the character is in focus, but the amount of blur here that I've thrown onto the picture can be adjusted with selecting the camera and then making these adjustments on the parameters tab. Let me show you where that is. So first of all, in the scene tab here, we're going to find our cameras. I've grouped them together. These icons here, this means these are groups. So the lights and the cameras are grouped together. If I were to open this whole menu, then I can see other stuff is below it. If I were to click this eyeball icon, everything underneath that group is being made invisible, and you can see the result in the viewport. So now basically the lights are out. We still have light in the scene, and this comes from something called the HDRI, or the global illumination, that I'll talk about in a moment. So if I switch this on, then all these lights come on again. But if I wanted to make one of these disappear, then I can just go and click one of these eyeball icons. Like if I switch the rim light off now, then we should see a change in our scene, namely that little catch light on the back of the character has now disappeared. This is one of those things that you have to look out for. This separates the character from the background, and you do that with a rim light. And if you don't have that, you stand a good chance that your character and your background don't separate enough. So like depth of field is another way to do that. If you were to switch the depth of field off, which we're going to do in a moment, then you have the character and the background kind of starting and stopping and blending into one another, and the viewer doesn't really know where one starts and the other begins, and as such the picture doesn't look as good as when you take care of separating these things. I'm going to go switch this back on and have a look at the cameras here. So on the camera here, on the cameras group, open that up, and then we'll see that we're looking at camera V1 close. That's this one here. So select it and then head over to the parameters tab. Whatever item you select in the Scene tab will change whatever is displayed on the Parameters tab. So the two are kind of linked. If I were to select the light, for example, then you see that these options here change because we now have the light category that we didn't have in the camera section. And if I do select the camera, then you'll see that we have a cameras and lens and blade selection and so forth. And we didn't have that with the lights, quite obviously. So if I select camera here, then you can see this option at the top, which says depth of field, and it's currently set to on. By default, when you create a camera, it is not set to on, it is disabled. If I do that, then iRay will show me this is what it were to look like without the depth of field. And while that is still a usable image, you can see that she and the branches are kind of intersecting here a little bit, and it is not as clean as if it had been on. The amount of the blur is governed, much like in real photography, by a value that we call the aperture value or the f-stop value, and this is where that is set. It is almost like in real life. So the default, which once again is the grayed out value, is 22, and in photographic terms it means that if I make this value larger, then the aperture will actually be smaller, and as a result I'll get less of a blur effect on my image. And likewise, if I make this value smaller, then I get a shallower depth of field, and as a result my depth of field will be more, my blur will be more. So let's go and play with that. If I go and switch this from 22 to 64, just type in that number, watch what happens. We still see blur, but it's less so. So I can now discover that there's some leaves here, that there are some leaves happening here. If I switch this to 128, then I still have a blur, but it's much subtler. You can go as shallow or as deep as you want. So if I go on Alt left click on the slider, it'll go back to the default value, which was 22. But if I make that 8, for example, then I get an extremely shallow depth of field. So she's starting to blur out, and I get this focus effect just on maybe one eye or one part of the image. So if you want to blur that out completely, then you can do that. And I've set up all cameras to use depth of field. You can use this feature and play around with that. One other important aspect of depth of field is that the camera needs to know what part of the image needs to be in focus. So right now this is something roughly 230 here. That's the next one up. This is the focal distance. If I change that, you can see I'll show you this in the second viewport in a moment, but you'll see that the focal plane is moving into a different position. So if I go and move that over here, then you can see it's moving closer to the camera, and as a result my picture gets completely blurry. Or if I go and move it beyond the point of what needs to be in focus, it might look like this. So if you render this out, you'll see there something is kind of wrong here, so you need to kind of find the correct spot, and I will show you in the Daz Studio masterclass how to do that in depth. For now I'm just going to go back to the value that I had looked at here. Just for completion, if I put my viewports back into top and bottom mode, I'll show you the perspective view down below in filament. And my camera object is over here. With it selected, I can see that I've got this big X here, and this is what happens if I move the focal distance. This point moves back and forth, and I need to find the correct spot, which is kind of on her eye, somewhere on her face, to get the accurate focal position here that I want. If I wanted to change the framing of my character altogether, I can do one of two things. I can either physically move the camera around with the camera selected. I can literally go and try to click this little blue icon here and move the camera further to my subject, and you can see what happens here. As a result, you can also see that my focal point moves with it, and as a result my picture gets blurry here. Or Control Z will undo that. Or you can go and choose your camera and then go and change the focal length parameter here. And that is equivalent to twiddling with the zoom settings on your digital camera. If you do that, you basically zoom in, but the position of the camera is not going to be affected. And also as a result, the focal plane is also not being changed. So left click and drag that slider and move in. You can see that something's happening visually in my top monitor there, but nothing's happening on the bottom aside from the size of that little rectangle that is framing my scene up. See that here? If I go and move it, look at it from here, look at this frame here. As I move the focal length, this is really what's happening. I see more or less of my subject. And the good thing is my depth of field is essentially not being touched. It might look a little shallow as I move in more or less shallow as I move out, but the focal distance isn't being changed. Very cool, that. So play around with that and do this on literally every camera. Whoops, that's not what I meant. 160 is the focal length value that I've picked here, and the default I think is 65, which is a bit too wide here for that. It's not quite a close-up, so 160 is the default value that I've picked for this scene here. And this works with literally every camera. If we were to do this on the camera that frames up the lady over here, then I can go and change my camera here into number 7. That's the V2 close-up. That's her. And then I also need to select it in the scene tab here, and that is now this camera here. Control F will frame up that camera. There it is. And I can do the same thing here. If I wanted to go in a bit closer here, I can just go and change the focal length, which is 200 in this case. Move it over, and then if she says something extremely important, now I probably need to correct my framing. I need to go and move the camera up a little bit. That is also possible. If you wanted to set up another camera so that you have 2 options to switch to, you can duplicate the one that you currently have. So if I wanted to make camera 7A now, for example, with that selected, head over to the Edit menu and choose Duplicate Nodes. And when you do that, you have another one that is just called camera 7 Copy. And you can select that, click in on it again until it becomes changeable, and then you can change something about it. So I'm just going to call that 7A, just for now, 7A. Hit return, and then it's called 7A. You can, over here, you can switch to it, and now we have 2 cameras, 7 and 7A. And so if I were to go and change my focal length to something closer here, like so, and then move my camera up to correct the framing, then I have enough room for a speech bubble here. As you work with characters, you might want to switch certain aspects of your scene off just for temporary preview reasons. So if I'm thinking I'm really only interested in how the character's expression looks here, then I can go and right click on her, hit Control F to frame her up in my bottom viewport. But maybe I'm thinking, hey, the couch and all these other bits and pieces, they really get in the way. Likewise, these drawn on light objects here, they're just a little bit much, and I'm getting confused. I want things to be a little bit plainer. Then there's a couple of ways that you can do that. The first one is that in your scene tab, you can switch things off that you currently don't want to participate in your render. So for example, my Rocky Mountains backyard. This is a group of items. So in it we have shade and a tree and the couch and all these things that we see in the scene. If I just want to remove all of these, I can click the eyeball icon like I've shown you. And when you do that, all these bits and pieces disappear. Except for in the iRay view, where sometimes you have to switch it off and on again to basically restart the render. But we're going to leave that for now. If we just look at the bottom monitor for now, the set is gone, but there's another picture in here that I wanted to talk about before we move on to other things, which is what's currently generating some of the light that we've talked about. So all the geometry is gone, but there is a picture that's being drawn on something like a sky dome. That is, imagine that's to be a very large sphere that is drawn on the very outskirts of your scene. We can't really walk there, and the size of the sphere is kind of an infinite thing, onto the inside of which is drawn a relatively high resolution picture. Not all that high res, because if you look at the picture, there's some jaggies here that are being smoothed out as the light is projected. So this picture is drawn on the inside of the sphere and then emits light onto the center of the scene, which is where our characters are. This picture can be changed, swapped out, turned around, made brighter or less bright on the render settings tab on a section called environment. This is where that is. And it has a lot of options here. And if you go and open this up, once again, you can whittle this down. The one that we're currently interested in is under Dome. So if you select Dome, then you have a lot less options to look at. And the environment intensity here, this has been set to 0.2. If I were to set this to the default, then we're going to see that the scene becomes more like a daylight scene. environment intensity and environment map are essentially the same value right now. This is where we apply the HDRI. You can apply your own if you buy products from the Daz store, or if you scour sites like Polyhaven. They have a lot of free HDRIs that you can download and put in here, and then you can illuminate your scene with a very different light effect. To increase or decrease the intensity, you can either use this value here or that value. It'll have the same effect. So if I go and stick with this, left click and drag, this makes the scene darker. Anything 0 or below 0 will basically just draw a black picture because there's no light from the HDRI coming in anymore at all. Anything larger than 1 will just make it really, really bright. And it's also going to be reflected here in the iRay viewport. I want to put this back to 0.3, I believe it was, and show you the next option, which is this one here, which is called Draw Dome. If we disable that, then the picture, the HDRI is still going to be drawn and participates in the lighting, but we won't see the background of it anymore. So disable that and you'll see this. So this is useful if you want to use the HDRI just as a lighting effect, but not as something that you want to really see. So if I go back to my previous lady here, the camera 6 close-up, if I wanted to put my own background in Photoshop, anything that we see in gray here will actually be rendered in transparent. So if I want to put a different color in it later on in post-production, I can do that. So if I were to render this with Control R, I can see that Control R, or the blue button on the render settings tab, I can see that the gray now appears as these little checkerboard icons that we know and love so much from Photoshop, like these ones, and they're telling me this is all going to be transparent. There we go. So that lets me do some funky post-production effects. Now that we've tidied up the scene a little bit so that we don't see the backdrops anymore, we still see a lot of these objects in here, and they're of course important to be here because we want them to stay in the scene so that they deliver the things that they want to do. I mean, the cameras I can switch off. That's cool. I can make them invisible just with the eyeball icon. I can still select them and use them. It's not going to make a difference. So if I wanted to change to another camera, I can do that. The cameras themselves are still there. But with lights, it's a different matter. If I go and switch off my light group, then my lights will disappear, but also they're no longer participating in my scene. So when the lights are gone, they're just no longer there. So there's another option that we can use if I switch both the cameras and the lighting on again. If I wanted to get rid of these objects that are being drawn on here, those are called the node avatars, essentially the representations of these objects in our scene. And this brings me to another tab that we need to quickly talk about, which is called the draw settings. Draw settings is over here. I've left it on, and it is a contextual menu of whichever draw style is currently selected in this viewport. So this one has the filament right now. If I were to click in the top one here, then there's this little orange outline that we see here, and now the draw settings for the iRay viewport would be shown because that's what we're using at the top here. iRay here, filament at the bottom here. So iRay currently doesn't show any node avatars, but filament does. So let me click into the bottom here. You can see these options change here. And then at the top here under drawing, we can see an option for draw avatars. If you disable that, then the lights will remain intact, but none of these things will be drawn anymore, including the ground plane. So that's something nice if you wanted to make a quick change to, say, her head, her expression. You can right click onto Victoria's head, Control F will zoom right into that, and then you can go and make all kinds of changes there and see what you think about them when they're coming up in iRay. But you don't get bogged down with other things like the light sources here that we just briefly saw up here. Tell you what, since we have the aux viewport, I'm going to get rid of this viewport and use the aux viewport for this very purpose, that we're always going to have a look at what does my current camera that I'm dealing with look like in iRay. So to do that, let's go and switch this over to filament first. Then we're going to go and switch my window back into the single view. Then I'm going to go to my perspective view over here, switch off my aspect frame, and now this is my wandering around camera. And my viewport over here, I'm going to go and switch over to iRay. Takes a second to cook, and I'm going to leave the aspect frame intact. I'm also going to go and switch this from the perspective view to the camera that is currently in question. So camera 6, And there she is. That's my close-up. Let's take a look how we can go and make some adjustments to the characters in the next episode with all these preparations. Stay tuned for that.